Okay, it's 12:01. Glenn, go ahead and let's get started.
Great, thanks, Janice. Well, the other day I started with good afternoon, but that doesn't quite work since we're all over the globe. So I'm going to simply start today with the word hello world. My name is Glenn Shore. I'm a member of the local organizing committee, and we are truly excited to have you all here today to what is our first Global World Transplant Games 5K Anyway event coffee chat. So before I begin today, I just have a few housekeeping notes. First of all, we have everybody muted for our guest today. We want to make sure that we have the best audio quality possible, so we have you all on mute. Should you have any questions, please type them in the chat section and one of our team members will respond. In the interest of time today, though, we ask that any questions please be limited to our speaker and his topic of conversation, or as Dr. Moritsugu says, his topic of dialogue, because we have dialogues, we do not have questions or answers. So we want to focus on that. As you know, today, the World Transplant Games 5K Anyway event is a worldwide event, and we are providing translation services today in French, Italian, and Spanish. If you would like to take advantage of these services, click on the interpretation globe located on the control bar. So I would now like to introduce our hosts for today. And first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the Order of St. Lazarus, Dr. Moritsugu, Mike Milner. They have provided Dr. Moritsugu's time today. So we truly thank the Order of St. Lazarus for their time and all their good works. I would now like to turn it over to Janice Burke. Janice is our CEO of the Harris County Houston Sports Authority, and she is our chair of the World Transplant Games, to introduce our guest and our moderator today. Janice, I turn the podium over to you.
Thanks, Glenn, and it's great to see everybody. I recognize people from all over the world on this call today, so we welcome you. It was kind of our idea of trying to get that networking, that support system, that kind of conversation that happens naturally when you're at a games in person. I really want to thank our Coffee Chat subcommittee. They've worked really hard to make sure we have great speakers, great topics, and we want all of you to join in. You can sip on coffee, you can be casual, use your chat. We really do want this to be participatory in nature. And so to our Coffee Chat subcommittee, Tricia Fleeman, George Kovacic, Donna Esposita, Kathleen Wood, Kayla Lehman, Priscilla Sloan, Zena Berry, I don't want to leave anybody out, Eunice Yvette Ray, Jessica Townsend, and Glenn Shore. Thank you guys, and I'm going to turn it over to Patty so we can get to the meat of the discussion.
All right, thank you so much, Janice. Well, it is my pleasure to introduce today Dr. Kenneth Moritsugu. And with all his accomplishments, I think I could probably fill up the entire hour with just his bio and his introduction alone. But let me give you some of the highlights. Rear Admiral Kenneth Moritsugu was the acting Surgeon General of the United States in 2002. And then again, from July 2006 until his retirement from the Commissioned Corps of the United States Public Health Service in 2007. As acting Surgeon General, he served as the nation's top doctor and has received numerous awards and decorations, including the Public Health Service Distinguished Service Medal, the Surgeon General's Exemplary Service Medal, the Coast Guard Arctic Service Medal, countless others. Like I said, I can go on and on forever, but he is currently the principal at First Samurai Consulting, a firm specializing in health consultations, where they say, putting the patient at the center of what we do is sort of their motto. And Dr. Moritsugu, you are the center of this coffee chat today. So welcome and thank you so much for being here.
Oh, Patty, thank you so much for inviting me, both you and the Houston Sports Authority and the Worldwide Transplant Games. I have attended both the US as well as the World Transplant Games in the past, and I know that it is a very, very uplifting activity.
Well, let's get started. You know, we're here obviously talking about organ donation and transplantation, and you check those boxes on multiple fronts. Can you just tell us a little bit about your involvement?
Well, thank you, Patty. My involvement has been on several levels. One, as a physician, obviously for my entire professional life, taking care of individuals and taking care of individuals within communities. And part of that, major part of that, is organ donation and organ transplantation. As you had introduced me, I've also been the Surgeon General of the United States, and being the nation's top public health doctor, it's provided me a venue to advocate for this life-saving, life-enhancing activity. But there is a third aspect to my involvement, because I am one of us. I am a donor family member. 35 years ago, my wife died in an auto crash. And because we had talked about organ donation and organ transplantation, the decision was very straightforward. And because of her, many people lived and had an enhanced quality of life. But that's not the end of the story. Because 4 years later, my 20-year-old daughter, Vicky Leanne, died in a separate auto crash. And she also became an organ and tissue donor. However, we didn't really know what she wanted, because how many of us actually talk with our children about organ donation, organ transplantation, and what they would like to do when they die? And so we were really wringing our hands over that. We decided that we would donate Vicky's organs and tissues. And shortly after, my older daughter came to us and said, "Hey, you know, Dad, we did the right thing." Because 4 years earlier, when Donna Lee, my wife, died, they observed how we, the family, were so much comforted by the fact that we were able to make good come out of a tragedy. And Vicky said to her older sister, "I want to be an organ donor when I die." And so serendipitously, or whatever you want to call it, that's how I became so much involved in organ donation and organ transplantation. Patty, that's the quick answer to your very pointed question.
Yeah, well, that's it's an amazing story, and it's hard for anyone, I think, to wrap their head around going through it once, let alone twice. And you and I have spoken about this before, and it's not just a cookie cutter process. You had two very different stories, probably, I'm assuming, two very different experiences between what you went through with Donna the first time and then your daughter Vicky.
Yes, definitely the case. Let me just lay the groundwork for my response to your question, Patty. This is not the donor games. This is the transplant games. And so someone might say, well, what are we talking about organ donation for? Well, it's two sides of the same coin, because there is no transplantation that can happen without organ donation. And the two of them go very much hand in hand. It's as important to advocate for organ donation as it is to advocate for organ transplantation. And to your specific question, we really had two very different experiences with my wife and with my 20-year-old daughter. When we arrived at the emergency room, Donna was taken there by the ambulance emergency services. We were met at the door by a nurse ombudsman who showed us into a quiet room and assured us that she would come back and give us an update about what's happening. We were cared for, treated with dignity, with respect, all the way through to the point where the neurosurgeon is walking down the hall with me after I've seen my wife lying on the hospital bed. And he asked then, What would I like to do? As I mentioned, we had talked about this before, and so it was a very natural response. Yes, we want Donna to be an organ donor. With regard to my younger daughter, however, that was a little more challenging because when we got the phone call that she's being taken to a local hospital because she's been involved in an auto crash, we rushed to the hospital and went up to the clerk and said, "Is Vicky Moritsugu a patient here?" And without even looking up at us, she said, "We don't know." And subsequent to that, we had to literally push ourselves into the emergency room to see who was in the emergency room on the hospital gurney being treated for an auto crash. She was then transferred up to the intensive care unit, where shortly after, in the middle of the ICU floor, the neurosurgeon approaches us and says, "It's time to declare your daughter dead." I had to insist on moving to a small room off to the side to take care of this communication very quietly and privately. The nurses there were all very busy, very professional. But then when I approached them to say, "Can I use your telephone to call our relatives?" they pointed me to the payphone next to the elevator and said, "You can't use our phone. It's only for professional use." Well, that's a long story. But at the same time, we had been dedicated to organ and tissue donation previously. And so we had asked that the organ procurement organization be called. They now approach. And what would you say to a request to donate at that point? If it weren't for the fact that we were so emotionally and intellectually dedicated to the concept of organ and tissue donation, I can pretty much assure you that someone else would have had a very colorful answer to a request for donation. The takeaway on this is that it's all about human beings. And whether it's about donation or transplantation, people make the difference. And it's not only the patient who's lying in the gurney who needs care, it's also the patients who are standing around the gurney, the family members, the loved ones who also need caring. And that has been really what I have tried to advocate for in the last 30 some odd years, that we must remember that there is always a human aspect to donation, just as there is a human aspect to transplantation.
Yeah, I mean, a human aspect, as well as really not just this particular incident, this case in what we're dealing with is so sensitive to begin with. But I think in any industry or anywhere, respect is so important for just your fellow human being, no matter what you're doing. But in a situation like that, to realize that human aspect and have respect for all the parties involved would have made that second experience probably so much more comfortable as it was the first time around.
I certainly would think so. And let me make sure that you understand what I just said. I'm not criticizing the physicians or the ward clerk or the nurse, all of whom were probably thinking, I am here to do my job and I am going to focus really hard on doing that. In their intensity of doing their professional work, I think they overlooked the aspect that it is not only the head that makes a difference. It's also the heart.
You know, I don't know if you know where either Donna or Vicky's organs, who received them. I've talked to a lot of families who have met their recipients, and there's relationships, there's bonds, there's just great stories. Do you know where any of the organs went from? And have you had any kind of relationships with those recipients? And can you speak to that either way, from what you went through as a family or from what you've seen from a physician's side?
Well, I can answer that very, very straightforwardly, because I think everyone is different. You can't paint everyone with the same paintbrush. Over the last 30, 35 years, as I've mentioned, as I've interacted with other donor families, with other transplant recipients, there are some individuals who are really driven, donor families who are driven to know where their loved ones' organs went, and they really are driven to attempt to meet the recipient. On the other side of the coin, there are some transplant recipients who are driven to find out where specifically their gift of life came from. There are others, however, who are quite satisfied in knowing that through that gift of life, somebody somewhere benefited. And that was the approach that I and my family had. We were uplifted, we were consoled, knowing that there are others who benefited from Donna's and Vicky's gifts. But we were not driven to have to find out where they lived, what their names were, and we need to put and we need to meet them personally. I do know where many of the recipients are and what they did. For example, and it's very poetic right now, because as we mentioned earlier, about a year or so ago, we've relocated from Washington, D.C. to Sarasota, Florida. And little knowing that, little remembering that Donna's heart went to a retired marine biologist in Tampa, Florida, which is less than 50 miles away from here. And just knowing that that has occurred, again, is so much a comfort. And it helps me and my family celebrate the lives of Donna and Vicky, just as every other donor family celebrates the lives of their donors.
You know, some people feel that everything happens for a reason, and people are put in different places for different reasons. And while what, you know, happened to your family and Vicky and Donna is incomprehensible, and we could even begin to understand the reasons, but with what you do, the highest, you know, position in the medical industry that you have, and all that you've been through, do you feel that there's, you know, a kind of an amazing platform that you have been given, and you are in this position maybe to really make something great out of the circumstances that happened to you, and in the position that you're in?
And because we are in a global chat room right now, I can share that the good Lord must have been looking out for us and had an overall plan. Inshallah, God willing, that would happen. And it really has been a gift to me and to my family, even through the tragedy, because it has focused me on using whatever access, whatever connections that I have, to bring this issue to the fore and to personalize this issue. People can talk about 120,000 people waiting on the waiting list, but who can put their arms around a number, 120,000? But stop and think about it. An average NFL stadium contains 67,000 people. So now when we're getting into the football season and we see our favorite team in their football stadium filled to capacity, think about that twice over. And those are the people who are waiting for an organ, just as those who are participating in these games have gained from that organ. And put it that way and imagine it. And you can put your arms around that concept much better than 120,000.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, if I've got a couple more questions here, but if anybody else has some questions, feel free to chime in here shortly. You can send your questions in, as Glenn had mentioned earlier on at the beginning. But Ken, you know, with all that you know and all that you've learned and all that we've kind of talked about and experienced, what advice would you give to this worldwide audience today, or what would you charge this audience with?
I would charge this audience with not keeping your talents and your situation under a bushel. And that is that there is nothing that makes the point stronger than a warm body standing in front of a group of people saying organ and tissue donation and transplantation are godsends to community. And I am one of those reasons. I am a personal manifestation of that. People remember people much more than they remember concepts. And so the one thing that I would ask, that I would beg, that I would pray that everyone on this call and everyone involved in donation and transplantation do is get out and make noise, make a joyful noise, and let people know that organ and tissue donation and transplantation are for real. They are now part of the community standard, and people are living years, if not decades, of a healthy, normal life, given our current surgical procedures and the science. So that is my plea to everyone here. And when you talk about the World Transplant Games, why is there an interest in the World Transplant Games, just as why is there an interest in the US Transplant Games? Because you see stadia filled with recipients, as well as with donor families who are participating in activity and purpose in their lives.
You know, I'm sure after you speak like this, you know, people have so many questions or want to come up and share their stories with you. And I'm kind of putting you a little bit on the spot to remember some of these right now without asking you in advance. But, you know, what kind of stories and what kind of response, what do you hear from people after you talk like this? And can, you know, does anything stand out, some really special stories or special comments that have come back to you?
Yes, and in fact, there is a single individual who is in the Order of St. Lazarus together with me. His name is Brian Hinesley. He is a retired Los Angeles firefighter who had liver disease, and he was literally on death's doorstep until he received a liver transplant. And because he received a liver transplant, he was able to get out and fight the San Bernardino fires. That is a takeaway that you can't buy. You know, it's one of these marvelous stories about giving and receiving and giving back to the community. So that is one of my highlights that I always think about when you think about organ donation and organ transplantation.
You know, when you talk to this group on here, what we just talked about before, and you kind of charged people with, you know, making noise and getting out there and reaching as many people as possible. If we can hone in specifically, I mean, as a donor family, do you have any specific advice to donor families out there? Either, you know, before the fact that they even know their donor families, or maybe someone who's going through it now. You've obviously run the gambit on it. What advice could you offer to donor families?
Well, to donor families, my comment is you are not alone. Do not think that you are alone, that when your loved one dies, you are in the depths of your grief. But there are professional groups, professional organizations in your very community whom you can reach out to, who would love to reach out to you as well. And they are the organ procurement organizations. They are the transplant programs who would love to engage people like you, like us, in getting out the human face of donation and transplantation. So it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity, and I will admit that it's a selfish opportunity for me. Why is it selfish? Because every time I have the opportunity to talk about Donna and Vicky, they come back to life for me. And I can engage them in their memory, and I can celebrate them and their memory. And it makes me feel so much better. There is not a day that goes by, even after 35 years, that I do not think of Donna Lee or of Vicky. But I always think of them with a smile on my face, because I know that their legacy has lived on.
Beautiful words for sure. And on the recipient side, you have not been on the recipient side, but with all that you've experienced and all that we're talking about now, do you have any advice for recipients or the recipient family?
Well, it's exactly the same of what I just mentioned, that from a donor's perspective, a donor family's perspective, we can celebrate in the legacy of life that our loved one has given. On a transplant recipient side, frankly, there are different thoughts that go through recipients' minds. One is a feeling of joy, obviously, that they are living now because they received the gift of life from someone else. At the other end of the spectrum, there can be a feeling of guilt, because how is it that I am living and my donor is dead? And I am taking advantage, quote unquote, of someone else's tragedy. Well, my message, what I'm trying to get across in this chat, is don't ever feel guilty about receiving an organ and living life to the fullest. Because from one donor family member, and I must admit that I do represent many, many other family members, not only in the United States, but globally as well. We rejoice in your living and your thriving. And so, not to, again, hide under your bushel, but rather get out there, let people know that you are a physical living person, benefits of donation and transplantation.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit for you from a question from someone on the in the chat here today. They wanted to know, what do you think is the biggest issue facing donation and transplantation today?
The biggest issue facing donation and transplantation is false information. And that's really what it comes down to. There are a number of myths that we have dealt with over decades. One of which is, well, I'm Jewish. I can't donate. It's against my religion. Or I'm Catholic and I need to be buried whole in order for me to rise again on the last day. Well, there is nothing farther from the truth, because there is no major religion in the world that is against organ donation and organ transplantation. I use the example of the Jewish religion. The American Rabbinical Council about 10 or 15 years ago came up with a pronouncement that organ donation is not only permitted, it's a mitzvah. A mitzvah, meaning it's a duty to do so, because by doing so, you are saving someone else's life. And in the Roman Catholic religion, the Pope has come out and said that donating one's organs is the greatest form of Christian charity. And I can go on and on and on, but that is one of those myths that make people hesitant. Another widely understood, widely spread myth is that, well, if I mark that I'm going to be an organ donor on my driver's license, when I get into the emergency room, the doctors will not take as good care of me because they want my organ. Well, again, nothing could be farther from the truth. That's one of the reasons why there are two teams. One team who is there to try to salvage your life, and a second team that only when it's determined that life cannot be salvaged is organ donation made possible. So getting rid of a lot of these myths is so important, number one. And number two, getting the message out that organ donation has an impact, not only on one person, but on society as a whole.
As we continue with some of the questions from the audience, the next one we have is, as a medical professional, did you feel that you were more prepared for what you went through, not only once, but twice?
Excellent question. And I alluded to this a few moments ago, and that is that we deal with life on two levels. One is the mind, and the other is the heart. One is the rational, and the other is the emotional. And as a health professional, one would expect that my rationality would overcome my emotionality. Well, I'll tell you, when you're faced with a tragedy, very similar to what I have experienced and many other donor families have experienced, rationality goes out the window. And it really comes down to trying to deal with the emotionality and trying to modify that with whatever rationality you can garner in that period of time. And so I would say that while as a health professional, I may have rationally known the good things that could happen, I think as a husband and as a father, I had real difficulty in dealing with that from an emotional perspective. And let me just mention, Patty, you're soliciting questions from the audience. And during this fireside chat, and I'd love to have this as a dialogue, that nothing is off limits, that I'm open to any questions or any topics that you would like to raise. So don't be afraid of hurting my feelings. I'm prepared, and I'd look forward to it. Thank you, Patty.
All right, well, as the dialogue continues, our next dialoguer asked, what have been some of the challenges that you've seen over the years in transplantation, and how have they sort of been overcome and changed?
Well, there is a current controversy regarding the organ donation and organ transplantation system. And we are currently examining both of those sides of the coin, in that there are questions in terms of, have organ procurement organizations really done all they can to recover all the organs, every single organ that they can? And the answer is some have done not as well. And this is one of those areas that is currently being examined to determine how we can move the entire organ procurement system forward to recover every single possible organ. However, recovering organs, as I mentioned earlier, is only part of the story, because the other part of the story is getting that organ transplanted. And therein lies some additional controversy, where certain transplant programs are more likely to accept organs that other transplant programs may not accept. And therein, again, lies a question of what can we do to assure that every single recovered organ does get transplanted. And that is one of those areas, both on the procurement side as well as the transplant side, that we still do have work to do.
From a Surgeon General standpoint, I mean, obviously in the US here, we have to make a choice to be organ donors. The person who wrote the question here in Ohio, they're now required by law that young people receive donation education in high school. From your standpoint, are there other ways that this can be sort of, I don't know, to get out in front of people to make that choice more prevalent and to raise that awareness?
Again, an excellent question. And I've got to also recall that we're talking to a global audience here. And the question is that different societies, different countries have different approaches to organ donation and organ transplantation. And clearly it's important to raise the level of awareness of the general population about the benefits that come from organ donation and organ transplantation. Some countries, notably Spain, has an approach where if you die, you are assumed to have agreed to donate your organs unless you have said no. In the United States, we are not at that point. In the United States, the assumption is that you have said no, unless you have indicated that you want to be an organ donor. Now, there are benefits to each of those. And there is nothing that says that one is better than the other than the fact that somewhere we need to have a worldwide dialogue, as we are here, as we are beginning to do so at the World Transplant Games, but also international professional organizations, to try to come together and find out how we can leverage either the assumed consent or the requested consent to increase the number of people who will donate, and increase by extension the number of those people who will benefit from transplantation. But let me just take that and go on a little bit of a tangent for a second, because people generally think that organ donation and organ transplantation affect only two people. One, the organ donor, and two, the transplant recipient. And I would argue that it affects so many more people, because an individual who donates has a family, has a community. An individual who receives a transplant is part of a family, is part of a community. And so the mere fact of one person donating an organ to a transplant recipient is not one in one. It's one community helping another community. And I use an image. Think of a quiet pond that you throw a pebble into this quiet pond, and the ripples move outwards, affecting not only the recipient and the donor, but also the family, the co-workers, the neighborhood, the community, the nation, the world. And so it really is one of those issues where it is much larger than one-on-one.
Well, something that's obviously been very current and prevalent this past year is COVID-19. How did COVID affect transplantation specifically for those that are on a waiting list?
Oh, that has really been a major issue, and I'm just elated that we in the United States, at least, are beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel, based upon each individual citizen taking on himself or herself the responsibility of masking, of social distancing, of vaccination. And given that, I think we are on a good trajectory to exit the end of the tunnel. COVID-19 has really created some major issues in organ donation and organ transplantation, because back when every single hospital bed was occupied by individuals suffering from COVID-19 and individuals who are suffering very severely and even dying from COVID-19. Organ transplantation and organ recovery became very difficult because you still needed to have a hospital bed on which to have the donor as well as a recipient occupy. And because of that, organ recovery has dropped, and organ transplantation also has dropped. This, I hope and I predict, will be changed as we are changing our trajectory. And in fact, I think now we are seeing many more people donating and having their organs recovered, and more people receiving transplants.
How do you respond to the notion of donors being paid to donate their organs?
It is a model. Frankly, from a personal perspective, I am against that model, because it just using the term a donor means you're giving. You're not being paid for something. And because of that, to take what otherwise is an altruistic gift and to monetize that altruistic gift goes against the concept of organ donation and organ donors. Now, having said that, I know that there are some individuals who argue, well, let's see, who makes money out of donation and transplantation? The hospitals make money, the physicians make money, the hospital administrators make money, the health plans make money. And on the other side, in transplantation, same situation. Who is the one who does not make money? The organ donor. And because of that, there is existing debate in terms of what can we do to encourage people and not discourage people from becoming donors. The law in the United States is very specific, and that is that we are not allowed to pay anyone for an organ or for organ donation. Some of the approaches have been, well, perhaps what we could do is help the donor family cover funeral expenses or burial expenses. And that's sort of skirting a very, very fine line. The debate is still on. The debate is still heated. But you asked me what I think about it, and I'm very clear. I think organ donation is donation.
Gotcha. So next question, how would you characterize the advancement in our clinical practices, and do you see these advancements changing?
I'm sorry, the last part of that question, Patty?
How would you characterize the advancement in our clinical practices, and do you see these advancements changing?
I definitely see an evolution, not a change, an evolution. One of the members of the Order of St. Lazarus, again, interesting, is a physician assistant. He is a surgical physician assistant, and he assists physicians in recovery and in transplantation. And given that, recovery and transplantation have been the area of expertise by surgeons. As I mentioned, this is an evolution, and the evolution is moving to incorporate more and more individuals who are not necessarily physicians and surgeons. In addition to that, as I started by saying, you know, donation and transplantation is a human issue. I think that we need to focus additional attention on the behavioral aspects of families, of donor families, and of recipients, transplant recipients, and their families as well. Because for a donor family member, for example, death is not the end of their life. They will have to live on. And I will admit that I and my family were beneficiaries of very, very good, careful, respectful counseling to help us move through our grief. That, I think, is something that is that needs some further attention, and I would anticipate that it will be a further evolution of this system.
You know, we started this today as I introduced you and talked a little bit about what you're doing now, and I think this is kind of a fitting way to end it as well. You know, you talked about putting the patient first at the center of everything, and the dialogue question that we have here is putting the patient at the center of everything we do is such a strong message, but how do we stay true to that message, and how do we hold ourselves to it?
By standing up for our rights. I will share with you an example. 19 years ago, my wife was pregnant. She, with our daughter, and she was a high-risk pregnancy. She was a little older in age. She had some blood disease problems and a neurological problem. And so one day she was talking with her OBGYN and suggesting that maybe we ought to get a team together to talk about how we're going to handle this otherwise high-risk pregnancy. The OBGYN said to her, well, we'll get together and we will tell you what we come up with. And she put her foot down and said, no, we, including me, are going to be getting together and we will come up with a plan. Believe it or not, the next day, the whole team and my wife and I were talking about the plan. And so I use that as an example about, and I've heard this before when I was in the Surgeon General's office, as we were doing the Surgeon General's report on mental health. There was a young woman who was suffering from a genetic disorder. And she came up and testified and said, you know, doctor, whenever my parents and I go to see the doctors don't talk to me. They don't look at me. They only talk to my parents. Please, doctor, nothing about me without me. And that is at the heart of putting the patient at the center of everything that we do. Nothing about me without me. Everyone, a donor family member, a transplant recipient's family, is a person, is a patient, and nothing should happen about that person without that person.
Well, beautifully said. And you said so much and shared so much with us today. We can't thank you enough for all of it. I know everyone on this has enjoyed it. And, we just want to, thank you, first of all, for being here. And I know there's been a lot of dialogue and you shared a lot of things with us. We do have another minute or so here. Is there anything that we've missed or any message that you would like to speak to this audience about that maybe I didn't hit upon?
Oh, I think that we have covered the waterfront, but my final comment to transplant, to donor families, rejoice in the legacy that your loved one has left for society and for the world. And for those of you who are fortunate, who either have received your transplant or are awaiting your transplant, God bless you and thrive, thrive, thrive.
Well, again, thank you so much. And Glenn, before I toss it back to you, Janice, you've got a big old grin on your face. You're smiling. Is there anything you'd like to kind of close out with on this before I toss it to Glenn?
No, I just think, Dr. M, you're so practical at your approach and letting people ask you whatever question, talk about any subject matter regarding this. Sometimes I think we just don't know what to say, right? Or we don't know how to feel, and we don't know. It's a touchy subject sometimes for people. And I think it's important, though, especially in this community, that people can have these raw, honest conversations. So thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you for the privilege of meeting with all of you.
It's so great to see all of you. I hope you'll join us for other coffee chats, and some of them will have a little bit more discussions, and we hope you'll post your pictures and you'll get your 5Ks in this week. But it's great to see everybody. Glenn, I'll let you close it out.
So all I have to say is wow. So first of all, to Dr. Moritsugu, to Mike Milner, to the Order of St. Lazarus, we thank you for your time and your talents and your passion. To the LOC, out in the subcommittee, Janice talked with Tricia and George leading it. We thank you. Janice, to your leadership in running the LOC, really appreciate it. And then also to Patty Smith, who we kind of went over at the beginning, but as our Vice President Communications, you run an interview like it's nobody's business, Patty. And we thank you for your time and we thank you for your talent. Just a couple of quick housekeeping notices. If you have not signed up for the World Transplant Games yet, or formed or built your team, you still have a chance. And we officially open today. We run until June 4th. So you can sign up and form your team. Remember, if you have a team of 10, you unlock a teddy bear that Janice is holding up right now, thanks to Tex and all our great sponsors, Texas Medical Center, Memorial Hermann. Really, let's put a bear and a child on the transplant list arms. It's what it's all about. If you have any follow-up questions from today, we encourage you to send an email to our email address, wtg2021@houstonsports.org. We will follow up with that. We also, the coffee chat train is just beginning on this coming Sunday at noon. we will have donor families from all over the world sharing their stories. On Tuesday at noon Central, we will have recipient families and recipients from all over the world sharing our stories. Because to be honest with you, without the donors and without the recipients, we're not here. And then finally, last but absolutely not least, on Thursday at noon, we will have representatives of the Transplant Coordinators and Transplant Nurses Society sharing their stories and leading a discussion. Also, on Wednesday and Friday, kind of jumping the schedule, we're going to have open houses. So if you want to come in and just talk and engage and really be part of the global community and the global family, we encourage you to do so. So it's just quick reminders, sign up, form your team, and we will see you at the coffee chat on noon Central Time Sunday. And I guess my closing words are everybody have a great day. Thanks for coming, and goodbye world. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Yeah, everyone. Bye-bye.